So Final Fantasy books were a really, really good way into the world of fantasy and role-playing. But what they weren't was role-playing games. You know, they were limited by page count, limited by the amount of time the author could put into it. So they much more resembled programmed adventures of the type we were seeing on computers, specifically text adventures. There was a game called Colossal Cave that released all the way back in 1976. But its influence lasted through the 80s, and there were a lot of fantasy games, and there was a lot of crossover. The crowning moment for this, I think, for people of my generation, was The Hobbit. So, I mean, one thing about Hobbit which was interesting was it was programmed, but there was a sort of rudimentary AI for the characters, so they would kind of walk around and they would do their own stuff. It's quite possible to get to an area and just find that all the non-player characters had killed each other, which was a kind of pretty weird situation to be in. It reminds me of the scene in Westworld where all the robots have just gone haywire and just destroyed each other. So, you know, computer adventure games, they weren't just kind of huge reams of text. You had arcade adventures. 1985 saw the release of Gauntlet in actual video arcades.
100 point.
Subsequently made its way onto home machines. The aesthetic was totally D&D. You were in a dungeon, looking top down. You were fighting ghosts and goblins and that kind of thing. Gauntlet was based on an earlier game called Dandy. Sounds like a weird name until you realise that it was specifically referencing D&D. Dandy is D&D. There's another game called Wizardry, which was from 1981, that inspired a number of games. The one that I ended up sinking hours and hours of my life into was The Bard's Tale, which started out in 1985 and kind of had a number of sequels. This was an attempt to model the actual mechanics of D&D onto a computer game. So you would create characters, and all the dice rolls and stat management was handled in the background by the computer. You know, it was all... you know, your choices were limited. You could just kind of go to different areas and fight different monsters and find treasure, but it really felt like a dungeon bash. You know, there were a couple of puzzles in there, but it was mostly kind of about slaughtering monsters. No actual role playing, of course, but it definitely felt like playing D&D. And these sorts of games eventually evolved into the likes of the Final Fantasy series, which started in 1987. And there were so many game concepts that, you know, had originally been created by D&D that were now firmly entrenched in video gaming. This idea of persistent characters kind of carrying on and getting experience points and then developing and going up in levels. You know, the idea of having a balanced adventuring party, which were able to do all different things. The idea of hit points, inventory management. So, I mean, inevitably, as video games became more sophisticated and impressive, the appeal of tabletop role-playing games began to wane, really. You know, games were really killing RPGs at this point. And obviously, like everything, they'd hit a point, they'd hit their apex, and then the only way was down, really. So from about 1983 onwards, the role-playing industry was falling as the computer game industry was rising. But the apparent death blow was not struck by video games, but collectible card games, predominantly Magic the Gathering, which was created in 1993. Obviously created by people who are fans of D&D, featured a very D&D based world, very D&D based artwork. It was incredibly profitable because, you know, obviously with a role-playing game, you can just buy the rule book and then you're away. You don't really need to buy anything else. With the collectible card game, you do need to constantly be buying new cards and creating new decks. And of course, it hit that collector mentality as well. It was like, you know, a 1-2 nerd punch. So TSI, even though it gathered a lot of income in the early 80s, it was never particularly well run as a company. And it was eventually bought out by Wizards of the Coast, which was the company that made Magic. And the future for RPGs really looked grim at this point.